Hey there. Do you ever wonder how the rich seemingly get richer year after year while you're still struggling? Or do you wonder, what are you going to leave behind for your kids? What kind of legacy will you leave for your heirs? What about you'd like to know more about financial freedom through passive and residual income? If any of these are topics you'd like to know more about, but you don't know where to start, let's get connected. I have a 10-part strategy to grow, protect, and transfer wealth that I call Pitranomics. I'm Juli Pitra. Join me in my Facebook group, and let's grow together. See you soon. Hi, everybody. This is Juli Pitra with Pitranomics, and this is what will be happening intermittently is the Wednesday Investor Corner. If I come up with something that I think is really, really crucial for investors to know about it, and I have a great guest speaker like I do today, like I did last time, I'll bring them on. We'll talk about these things and how to make investing better. So Wednesdays, specifically for real estate investors. And today I have Bill Kunowsky, who I've worked with for, I think, 7 years now. And he's with Chicago Title. He's an excellent escrow agent. I always know he's taking care of things according to the contract. And if you guys need him, he's going to put his information in the chat for you. But here today to talk about investor tips from Title, Bill Kunowsky. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Julie, for having me, and thank you for the lovely introduction. You and I have previously spoken about some of the things, and I think I just want to go right to the very beginning and start discussing the contract. My job as an escrow agent is to work from the contract. The contract's my guide. And on how I prepare the documents, on how everything is going to come together at the end. And I've been finding working with various investors that there seems to be a growing, we like putting in special provisions, a very short statement of buyer to pay seller closing costs. Well, that's great because most of the time on the contract, on page 2, we've already established the fact that the buyer is going to be paying for the title insurance. And now we're talking about other costs. And since most scenarios with investors do not include agents, you have an agent representing either party, you're relying on the communication between the buyer and the seller. And the closing cost thing is one thing. You need to spell out what it is you're intending to pay for. Regardless, the contract states specifically what expenses are seller expenses and what are typically buyer's expenses. But there's a misconception, I believe, that many sellers in these deals believe that taxes may be part of it, that there shouldn't be prorations, there shouldn't be anything of that nature with regards to taxes and document preparation for the warranty deed, and things of that nature. My interpretation of the contract's pretty specific about what the charges are that are the seller charges, but closing costs and title insurance are separate to each other. So my recommendation on this particular thing is that if you're going to pay for closing costs, spell them out. Escrow fees, tax certificates, document preparation, preparation, or actually even more specifically, preparation of the warranty deed, because many times on these investor deals, we have curative things that need to take place. Sometimes it's getting a release of lien from a bank to record the clear lien that's been paid in full, but it's still showing up on title. And that costs money. The recording charges should not be passed along to the buyer, because the buyer isn't the one that's responsible for clearing title. They didn't come into this having any expectation that they were going to be paying anything other than these certain items. And that way, by being specific as to what you intend to pay for as the buyer for the seller, it's really important that you do that.
Hey, Bill, can I just jump in on one thing?
Absolutely.
A lot of investors do not use the TREC 1 to 4. And we're talking about here in Texas, the promulgated contract, which is what this is. This document is 11 pages long without any amendments or addenda. It's pretty long. And there are people that use the 2 and 3 page format in the investor world. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but today we're going to specifically talk about how title companies read the TREC contract, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about the squirrelties, I'll call it, in the non-TREC contracts and how they can be misinterpreted by both parties in an investor deal, especially when there's no representation.
Yeah. And that's the things, the buyers, when they're approaching the sellers, there's a level of trust that needs to be established, which most investors realize that the sellers are really relying on the buyers to guide them, because they believe the buyer is an expert, and they may not be an expert in contract preparation. So I think that the 1 to 4 family that we use in Texas covers most of the bases. And the one thing that I tell all new real estate agents and any new people that come to work with me, the first thing I tell them to do, read the contract from start to finish, all 11 pages. It's not exciting reading, but it spells it all out. And that's really the purpose. It's, the contract's the roadmap to get from the opening of escrow through the close of escrow. So you have to pay a lot of attention to those details, which is going to segue into the next thing. On page 9, I believe. Is it 9? Yes, page 9. On page 9 of this contract, it's got a big box in the center that says executed the blank day of blank month and the last 2 digits of the year. This must have a date. When the seller, whatever date that the seller accepts the offer, that date needs to be placed in the effective date, because every other date within the contract, every reference to X number of days for this, X number of days for that, all turn on this date, not the date on the DocuSign signature. You need to fill in a date, and that can cause you a lot of problems down the road. Those are 2 things: specifics, being very specific about what your intent is, and making sure you have the proper date on here. Huge. The other thing I'm going to go back to, which is earlier in the contract, is that Julie and I have had this ongoing for quite some time, is surveys. Surveys are a really important part of real property transactions, because the survey shows you all of the markers from the corner, all the generally of the lot square or rectangle. You've got your corners marked, and you've got your property line, your boundary lines established. And in a lot of more rural areas where there are lots and blocks and the legal descriptions seem very simple, they're not. Or two properties have been kind of joined together, but not officially as one. And that doesn't necessarily work, because then we've got two separate legal descriptions and parcels. And we really want most of these, unless you want them to be two separate parcels, we want them to be integrated into one piece of property, because that's what you're purchasing in most cases. But surveys surveys are critical, I think, so that you know what you've got and where things are going, because most investors are not going to go in and take the or they're going to take the property as is, but most everybody has plans for the property, and you need to know whether or not you can make those plans work. And just because there's a fence there doesn't necessarily mean that's your property line. And a lot of these properties that are less expensive, people don't have existing surveys. Here in town, a lot and block standard survey is going to run you $500. You get out into more rural areas, and those surveys get more expensive because they fall into another category of meets and bounds, which we can discuss at another time. But it's a more complicated survey.
I would like to jump in. The most expensive survey I have paid for in the rural areas was just over $4,000.
Yeah.
So, and it was a monster from the perspective of verifying all of the markers. And it was, like you said, on a lot and block, but that was not the legal description that prevailed. It was the meets and bounds. Mm-hmm. And it took them, I don't know how many visits out there to go and confirm.
Right.
And that was, how shall I say, unexpected.
Unexpected, yes. And that's not something that you as the buyer want to walk into. The other good thing that I will say, that I'm going to give accolades to Juli, when there is no existing survey that can be used to verify anything, for verification purposes, she usually puts in that the buyer will purchase the survey after the delivery of the title commitment. And we'll just now go right into the title commitment. The title commitment's the document which you've received them. Most people don't look at them because they're relying on the title officer, the escrow agent, whatever you want to call us. Not just title, please. We have functions and names. But I lost my train of thought. Forgive me.
Title commitment.
Title commitments are going to give us some specific information. First of all, it's going to show you who the owners of record are. That's important because that's who we should be working with as seller. The one thing I think most investors need to know is that not all sellers are the true owners of the property. We have it's happening, I believe, nationwide. We're having a huge outbreak of it in Texas, and that is people pretending to be the owners of vacant properties or lots. You don't want to get into a situation where you find out that you've paid money to the title company. You'll get it back most likely, but you don't want to get involved with someone other than the true owners. And this is one of the reasons why we do the title commitments. We figure it out at that point. But the one thing about rural property is those title commitments take much longer to get. There are a lot of smaller counties that have not gone completely automated, that have title plants that are there, and we have to get the title work, title reports from those title companies, and they move at their speed. They know they have a way of operating, and they continue to operate that way. It's not like here in the fourth largest city in the country now, in Dallas, where things are very automated and things can happen quickly. So it takes time to get the documents. But the critical thing about title commitment isn't always who the owners are. It's what's on Schedule C. And those are the conditions for us to be able to close and issue a title policy. That's where you find out if we've most likely if there is someone who is deceased, because their name is not mentioned on the contract, but it's mentioned in the ownership and the vesting of title on Schedule A of the title commitment. And that's why we usually just wait until we get something concrete before we start a survey, engage a surveyor to make sure it's a property that you as the buyer want to close and you want to pursue. Sometimes there's things on title, even though the property is perhaps a bargain, that are going to be impediments from us being able to close in a timely fashion. I've run into issues where there have been other investors involved, and they've filed memoranda of contract to let the world know that there is already a contract on this property. Industry, title insurance underwriting attorneys don't like them for many reasons, but they do cloud title. And a lot of times it's very hard to get that interest removed, and it may not be worth the aggravation. Every buyer is different. Some will say, okay, we'll go ahead and we're going to work on this. And you try to work with the investor to get it released somehow. But the bottom line is that's why the title commitment is important, and to review it and to ask questions if there are any before you go forward and start spending anywhere from $500 on surveys. You don't want to have a property surveyed and then not be able to not be in the position to purchase it. And the other investor may not want the survey, and they're definitely not going to pay for it. So that's going to come out of your earnest money or additional money you're going to have to pay. So
you know what, Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt because we're kind of on a roll, but I want to take a step back and talk about the difference between people who normally buy their own residential home and what they think title company does for them, to what investors who normally don't have representation. So we talked about the different contracts that people use, but can you just give first kind of an overall view of what you think the title company's role is in the transaction between buyer and seller? And then let's talk about when there is not professional representation, both parties have to step up and handle more than maybe they would have had there been representation. So we talked about the type of contract. You've mentioned a few things, and I want to get back to that, but I think most people don't even understand what is the true role of the title company in closing their transaction when there's no realtor involved or no other representation.
And this is where, this has been a question that's gone on for a very, very long time. So lots of people believe that realtors are not necessary. That's why you see these for sale by owner situations, because they don't think that there's this much value. They don't see the value in the agent. Well, I will tell you, there's great value in agents because, first of all, they represent you, okay, and are looking out for your best interests, and they are the ones who know these contracts. They know what to look for. They know, a lot of the ins and outs that the general public doesn't know. The title company's job is to receive a contract, get an order opened, accept the earnest money and option money if there is an option period, and to deliver certain items. The title commitment. Basically, there's a provision on there that says we have to deliver it in X number of days, which is usually not that big a deal unless it's out of county. And I will tell you, many rural counties, you're looking at 3 to 5 weeks, and that's like 20 to 25, 30 business days, which can become a little bit burden. Sometimes we have to just deal with it. But what we are is an independent third party. We're a facilitator of the transaction. We don't represent the buyer. We don't represent the seller. We are being directed by the parties to the contract. And if there's an agent on both sides, that means that you have representation as a buyer or seller to help guide you through the navigation of a real estate transaction. This isn't always easy because there are times that there are questions that need to be answered that buyers and sellers don't necessarily know. They are responsible for helping us to get through these things and clear up any questions. What's your intent? What did you all want to do? Because this is what the contract says. We go through and review every paragraph of the contract where there is a variable, and we work from that as we are instructed by the contract. That's our job. And to clear the property so that we can pass clear title to the buyer, because title insurance, if you didn't know, now you will, is unlike other insurance in that title insurance insures you from the date of purchase backwards in time. We're not looking at some future. Well, we're making sure that we've given you a title insurance policy that we're not going to have to defend anything on it, because we've made sure that everything has been taken care of and addressed. That's our job, to convey clear title, to make sure we're those sellers conveying clear title. So the only time you'll use this title insurance would be sometime in the future. If some party was to come forward and claim some sort of an interest in the property, and, it's possible. I mean, in recent years, our business has been bombarded with business. We've had lots and lots and lots to do. There's a lot of title companies that have popped up. There have also been shortages in the workforce. And a lot of people have been hired that don't think for themselves, because they don't have the knowledge. And there are things that can come up in the future that may end up being a claim on your owner's policy. And that's why you get title insurance. And why it's so important that you get title insurance, because if a mistake was made somewhere along the wet line, and it's not necessarily even with the closer or the person who's working your contract, somebody else could have made a mistake somewhere along the way. And the last thing you want as a buyer is to find out that there were taxes that were missed, that were due, and you're receiving a tax bill.
Yep.
Well, and it's $5,000. Well, You don't want to pay $5,000 for taxes that weren't yours. That's a situation where then you would go back and on your owner's policy, and you may or may not have a claim, depending on the exact scenario. It's always fact-based because contracts are legal, and it's all about the facts on that. I'm trying to think of what else. Is there something else specifically?
Yeah, I want to talk about what you said. Well, let's talk about the TREC contract paragraph 6, which I have, and it discusses title policy and survey. And I get it. If you're going through this contract, there's a whole lot of stuff. As you can see, there's one place to check something, one place to check something. It seems pretty standard. People like to use the word boilerplate. There's nothing really special about it. Well, I'm going to tell you that some of the biggest fights I've had on contracts, and I don't mean fights like we're duking out, I mean disagreements about what the contract intends, has been from paragraph 6, which talks about title policy and survey, and also paragraph 7. So if we start with paragraph 6, it does say seller shall furnish to buyer at whosever expense. Keep in mind, title company is issuing the policy, but the contract is written that seller shall furnish to buyer.
Yep.
So as a seller, if you know you have clouds on title, if you know there's something a little less than clear or somewhat ambiguous about your ownership, preferably before you go under contract, that's been taken care of. But if not, quickly taken care of, because you need to furnish information to the title company, to your escrow agent. Sometimes that's community property ownership, sometimes that's heirship issues or whatever, because you have a shall in here in the contract. Seller will provide to furnish to the buyer an owner's policy. The negotiation is who is paying for it, but whether or not it is able to be issued and furnished to the buyer is not an issue. Just who's paying for the policy.
Correct.
But that seller has to do what they have to make sure that policy can be furnished. And
right.
Yeah, and then down here in section B, within 20 days after the title company, I can't read today, receives a copy of this contract, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment for title insurance. Our contracts do not say title shall furnish. It says seller. Title company is not party to the contract. Title company is facilitator of the contract that's brought to them.
There are many things that we do on behalf of the seller, because the seller can't do a title search and do a title opinion. So yes, those are the things that why we are a part of it. And we are supposed to be the ones that understand all of the information on the contract and how to interpret, how read it. And the best thing to do is not to interpret it. Most of it's very straightforward. The Texas Real Estate Commission has been really good about clearing up ambiguities within the contract. They're trying to write it in very plain language for most people to understand reading it. But the implications and the ramifications of those statements are the things that are not known. And then we get down to, there's a standard exception on every owner's policy about surveys, about the land. Now, if there's no survey, but there are some transactions that do not require a survey for the title company. Lenders are the ones that generally want surveys, but surveys are of great benefit to the buyers as well, because it shows them what they're buying. They get to see a picture of what they're legally purchasing. And there's a standard exception that's on the policy when it comes to discrepancies or conflicts or encroachments, protrusions, overlapping, as in 6A8. And there is a way, if you have a survey, part of that will be amended. None of that will be amended for on the owner's policy unless you check the box that says will be amended to read shortage is an area at the expense of buyer or seller. That's a crapshoot. It's whoever wants to pay for it. And it's usually not that expensive. It's for single family residents, 5% of what the owner's policy is. It's not a lot of insurance, a lot of money to pay for what you're getting. But then we get further into the commitment areas where we're talking about the commitment and the exceptions. And the exceptions are the exceptions. There's Schedule A, which is who owns it, okay, and the legal description. Schedule B is the list of exceptions to coverage, things that are not going to be insured on the owner's policy. There are documents of record that are usually listed there if there are recorded deed restrictions, if there are oil leases that are been recorded of record, any sorts of easements that have been granted to the city or the county or the state for whatever reason, those things do not get insured because we know about them. And so anything that's enumerated, and then there's some general standard exceptions, and we won't get into that so much. But if you have specific intentions when you purchase these properties, in the older subdivisions, even the one here in Dallas and some of these older subdivisions, the deed restrictions state that you can't have anything more than a story and a half. You can't have any front entry garages. They all have to be side entry or rear entry. If you intend to go in and do something like revamp or take the structure down to one wall, whatever it is, you've got to follow those deed restrictions because they continue to run with the land. And although somebody can object, even if you live even if it's a subdivision without a homeowners association or an architectural control committee, a lot of them say no farm animals. Well, people have chickens in places now. And if they were put in a chicken coop and there was something against having farm animals, any owner within that subdivision would have the right to challenge that and say, that's an annoyance. You need to get that out of there, kind of thing. But anyway, the basic point is if you have specific intentions about things that you want to do, look at that portion of the commitment. Now we'll get into the survey portion.
Let me just a little bit more about the title commitment. So as investors, for the most part, we're not buying the property to live in it. But even if you are, let's say you're moving into the property and down the road, you're going to want to build a pool, maybe an ADU or something like that. If you know that at the time that you're buying the property, you can include these are things that, like whatever activity you want to have on there, you want to make sure that you know that. You don't tend to know that when you're buying a property at the time you write the contract. So you have to understand your intentions and then put it in the contract and then verify through your own due diligence that you're able to do it. So let's say I'm buying a property that I want to flip. And I'm like, I noticed that most other properties in the area have board-on-board fences, and I'll just throw up a fence. Well, you can't really just throw up a fence. There are many municipalities that are going to say you need a permit to put up a fence. And if you put up a fence, then you need to have a survey and a recent survey that shows any changes. Or let's say you want to throw in a pool. You can't just throw in a pool. You have to make sure that you are able to do it and there are no objections or exceptions or limitations in your title commitment. So that's why you have to read that. You have to understand what's going to be done with it. And if oftentimes there's an investor involved, there's no agent involved, you have to be intentional about understanding what your plans for that property are and to make sure they won't be objected to or halted because you failed to follow through on your understanding of title commitment.
Yep. And that goes right into the surveys too.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Goes right into the survey.
Because the pool, you know, there may be no restriction against having a pool, but there might be an easement of record on Schedule D that would make it prohibitive. I mean, the easement runs right through the middle of the backyard. If you build a pool into that easement, and that easement has to be accessed by whoever it belongs to, they're going to come in and tear your pool out to get to it, and you're not going to be covered. I mean, you don't, and I've only because I've seen this happen before. I mean, a builder built a house in a subdivision and built and put the pool in. It was the model home, and a portion of the pool was built through an electrical easement that we could not get rid of. And so whoever bought that house had to buy it subject to that easement or that pool being in that easement. And we didn't cover it. So there's things there to look for. There's so many things as investors without an agent. You just have, and if you have questions, then you come to us. And if it comes down to something that's legal and we can't answer the question, we can usually get it answered by somebody that is a lawyer. Our lawyers cannot give you advice as to anything, but they can clarify provisions in the contract and with situations, give what the option, what's the contract provides for, and what your options are. And again, like I said, that goes right into surveys because easements are shown on surveys. If you're looking at a copy of the survey and the easement is in the middle of the backyard, right then and there, you're going to see it. And then you're like, well, I don't want this house because I can't put a pool in. And even if it's an investment, even if you're going to flip it, you want to put in a pool and an outdoor kitchen because that's what this house screams for. If you have an easement going through the middle of the backyard, it's not going to work. So
I would like to share an incident where I bought a property. This is in rural Texas, and the property adjacent to the one I purchased, unbeknownst to me, had the water line, not where the meter was, but from the city tap, the water meter traversed the neighbor's property. The meter was on the neighbor's property, and then it went across to the property that I owned. And then there was no formal easement provided to my water line. So when that neighbor objected and said he did not want my water line nor my water meter on his property, guess what? It had to be moved. I had to move it in the middle of
the job. And that was at your expense.
It was at my expense. So yep. I try to learn from each little happening that has. It's like, okay, where are my easements? I'm looking at my surveys and I'm asking questions. What's going on with this survey? So the fact he wanted to, I think he was raising miniature ponies or something, and he wanted to dig something. And he went through the water line, which caused a problem. And so he and my contractors, the neighbor and the contractors, got into it. They were like, you destroyed the water line. Now, if I had been there, I wouldn't have got into an argument with him. And he was like, well, this isn't supposed to be on the property. And the contractors, well, it is. I'm sure it's supposed to be that. And it had been that way probably for 50 years, 60 years, 100 years. I don't know. But when it came down to it,
there was how long it's been there.
When it came down to it, I did not have any declared and recorded easement that transferred with the property saying this is just going to stay the way it is. So moving, and in this particular case, the tap was across the street from the property. So I had to pay for cutting through the road, putting down from that tap to my property, and repairing the road. That was a slightly unexpected expense. Had to happen.
Yeah. And, you know, Julie, you brought up a great point there. And I think that's one of the things that people don't realize about real estate agents, experienced investors, title people, because most of our knowledge that saves people from pitfalls is cumulative from the time we joined the business. And, you know, I'm not going to say that there are closers out there that have only been closers for 2 or 3 years that just got into the business 2 or 3 years and have never done anything in real estate title before. But let me tell you, life experience is part of doing this job and knowing what works and doesn't work, because you see the mistakes that have happened along the way. And some of the stuff, I mean, my goodness, I wish I had started keeping a journal back in 2006 when I started title in Texas with somebody. But, you know, I was an assistant for an escrow officer that had already been doing title for 20 years and upwards. I'll give her a little break. But she had, you know, 17, 18 years under her belt of doing the job. And back to before things were automated, when they were actually typing closing statements with a typewriter and carbon paper. I'm just saying, this is where we've come a long way. But so much of our knowledge is cumulative and from the things that we've experienced and we've had to fix, or we couldn't fix, or that cost us money. And some people, you know, they just don't have that additional insight to help people navigate through these things. My biggest thing, and what I care about most, is making sure that none of these horrible things, and there have been some horrible things that I've seen happen.
That have happened to me.
That have happened to Julie, that have happened to other agents as well. And for one, I'm going to say as an example, please scroll down to the next top of the next page, Julie, where we get to the survey, or back up to the top of it. Because this paragraph C, survey, has always had these 3 choices. Within blank number of days after the effective date of this contract, sellers shall furnish to the buyer and the title company the seller's existing survey of the property and a residential real property affidavit that has been promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance, the T-47. Okay. That's a pretty clear statement of what the seller's responsibility is. And it goes on to say, finally, in bold letters. Finally in bold. I mean, this provision changed to the way it pretty much is structured now. I think it was 2008. Because the whole portion about if the seller fails to furnish the existing survey or affidavit within the time prescribed, buyers shall obtain a new survey at the seller's expense. It doesn't say anything about anything else. That statement follows what the seller has been what the seller's marching orders, if you will, are. And then it says what happens if they don't do that. Mm-hmm. Now, if they do provide it and the survey is deemed unacceptable to the title company, the buyer's lender, or the buyer shall obtain a new survey at either the seller's expense or the buyer's expense. That's only if the seller performs per the first sentence in this paragraph. If the seller does not perform, the buyer gets a new survey at the seller's expense.
Yes.
Now, the one thing that I will say, this is something that's really important for you investors out there, because you have to understand what that says. Now, most investors, as buyers, you're pretty easygoing and this, that, and the other. Sometimes that's not in your favor. And if a seller can't, this is what I tell agents. If the seller doesn't hand it to you at the time give it to you before the listing goes live, don't allow that checkbox, that paragraph, to be selected. Select number 2 and say, with the next number of days of the effective date of the contract, the buyer shall obtain a new survey at buyer's expense. One thing I can almost probably say 85% of the time, if the seller can produce a survey, the buyer will use it. If it looks like it's supposed to, and they know that there haven't been any changes.
I want to jump in on one other thing.
Because we faced a similar situation.
Yes. The T-47 is an affidavit that the seller signs if they have a previous survey that says, to the best of their knowledge, nothing has ever changed from the time this survey was made until now. Now, suppose the seller only has a survey from before they even bought the property. That's one little hiccup. And the other, let's suppose somebody puts up a fence. If you're an agent, you're asking these questions, or at least you can look and say, oh, that fence doesn't look brand new. You might, in conversations, ask the seller about the questions if you're a listing agent. But if you're an investor and you go and you look at a property, and I, as an investor, not only have I bought properties sight unseen, I've put in a contract with less than 15 minutes of spending time on the property. And this is why I like to write my own contracts. I'm like, I'll say, do you have a survey? If they say yes, I'm checking box 1. If they say no, I'm like, okay, I'm going to pay for it. I'm checking box 2, but I've asked the question. Do you have a survey? Yeah, we have it. Sometimes they show it to me. Sometimes they give it to me right then. I try to be fair, but come on, guys. If you're going to be investors, and you're going to be investors buying multiple properties, which I hope everybody chooses to do at some point that's listening to me, know your contract. I prefer if people use the contract that's promulgated, because it protects both sides. It keeps you from looking like a predatory investor as well. But know your contract. Know each and every paragraph, because the person who's at title, your escrow agent, knows each and every paragraph, and they are going to execute according to the terms of the contract you willingly entered into.
So, and in many cases, you as the buyer you're the one that has prepared the contract. And the last thing you want to do is to put yourself in a position of vulnerability, being vulnerable to the seller, withdrawing from the transaction, or refusing to pay for something, or anything like that. That's why, specifics. If you're going outside the bounds of the contract and you're going to do something, that's why, at the very beginning we said state specifics. And I will also say this with regard to surveys, because this is a lesson we've just recently learned. When purchasing from an estate, and a seller provides a survey and a T-47 affidavit that says nothing has changed, be sure to compare the legal description on that survey with the title commitment when you get it. And if there's only one legal description on the survey and there are 2 parcels listed in the legal description, chances are you don't have a survey of the entire property.
Yep.
And I'm just going to say this, 2 very experienced people didn't catch it. And the other thing that made it even more difficult for us is that it was an estate that was selling the property, and an heir executed the affidavit stating that nothing had changed. And they had never really even visited the property more than a couple of times. So how could they, even to the best of their knowledge, I mean, that's a stretch, state that nothing's changed? I mean, let's be for real. On that one, that's a situation where we're falling back on it, where, you know, the seller should have been paying for a new search, should not have accepted that provision, because we did reject it. It ended up being rejected. But there were many other things involved in all of that.
It wasn't acceptable to title, but they didn't perform in getting the survey and the T47 within the time prescribed.
There's multiple facets to that snafu on that, you know. But once again, this goes back to picking things up. You know, my knowledge is a compilation of years of working in this business and seeing the things that can happen. And I think that's why, you know, I'm in Dallas, and some people, you know, oh, I work out in Denton or whatever. You know what? The thing is that it doesn't matter really where you're located so much as it is knowing what you're doing and looking for people with experience. Just because somebody is, you know, I hate to go back on it. You know, in real estate, it's, you know, back in the day, there were so many business cards with glamour shots on them. I can't even begin to comment. But, you know, it has been the industry has always been, people want to work with the pretty people, or the people that look the most successful, drive the better cars, so on and so forth. And in title, that's, you know, and in real estate, that's not necessarily the best gauge of the person's abilities.
I'm sorry, Will, to work with you. Will, you're being too nice. It is not in any way an indication of how well that professional will perform for you in a clutch situation. I don't think so either. This is just a commentary on the industry, and there are a lot of very attractive people out there that know what they're doing because they've been doing it for a long time. But there's a lot of people that are new to the industry that, you know, are using their God-given talents, et cetera, to earn business. And they may not be the best person for you as an investor. Investors, you guys are different because you need a little bit of hand-holding and a good closer. When you develop that relationship, again, we are a neutral third party. We will help you to navigate through the transaction. And I think that's what it really, you know, investors learn a lot along the way. You know, we all learn from the best learning process is making mistakes and then trying really hard not to make them again.
and not getting caught by things that have caught us. And when you work with experienced people, investors, get a mentor, somebody that's been doing this, that knows what they're doing, or has been doing it long enough to help you maneuver through this. There's a lot of money to be made, but there's also a lot of stuff that can happen to you legally if you don't make the right choices. And nobody wants to be involved with that. And I think I'm gonna close up on partnering and whatnot. Mentors are not your partners. Mentors are people that you're gonna have as someone to exchange ideas with. I don't need to define it, but partners are different than mentors. And I have had several situations where two investors decide they want to work together on a project. They find something, and they do not spell out their agreement between the two of them as to how this whole project's going to go down. There's no
no contingency plans.
No set of instructions of who's responsible for doing what and when, and if such and contingencies and how things are going to be handled. It's not going to work well if you do that, because something is bound, unless, even if it's someone that you've known for your entire life. Money will always be money. Money will always be that create contention between people, whether they are friends or not. And so if you have an agreement that says that A is responsible for the finances, B is responsible for doing this, and then A and B are jointly going to decide this, that, and the other. And at the end of the day, when this transaction comes to fruition, this is how we're splitting our money, or who gets what first, and then the profit split. I'm telling you, I cannot believe how many situations come about because people have not, the best word for it is memorialized, putting it in writing. Who does what and what percentage they're getting and what they're actually going to do and be able to hold each other to it.
Bill, can I just jump in and share one incident that you know about where two people got together to flip, or two entities, three, I don't know how many people were involved. They couldn't even agree how to disperse closing funds.
Well, the other thing is,
title can't just be like, I'll do whatever one person wants. They are the neutral party. They have to do what you decide. You as partners,
and you can't pick sides, and you have to say, from my position, I was left in the position that says, you people, you need to figure this out amongst yourselves. And then it turned into I'm not talking to this person. This person does nothing but yell at me. It just went on and on. And then you had it ended very badly for everybody involved. And this is the thing, you can have great partnerships out there, but you have to establish the parameters for the project. And that's what it comes down to. That's the other thing that they didn't agree on, was what they were going to do with the property once they bought it. They had there were different schools of thought. Somebody thought that the realtor was supposed to tell them what to do. Though the realtor tried to tell them what to do, they didn't do it. And then, that's why we use this. That's why the moral to the story is, don't use some 3-page contract
Mm.
When you have a perfectly good 1 to 4 family contract that tries to cover everything there is, there's nothing left to be decided after the fact.
Bill, do you
And
mind if I take like a couple of minutes just to run through some pivotal points on this contract, and you can
sure,
sort of speak to about them? So this is
sure.
page one. Remember, this is 11 pages. It has the parties, remember, seller and buyer. Hopefully you've got that right. Here's a hint. If you're an investor and you're talking to a seller, get an ID. Just take a copy of their ID and have it with you. Do you agree, Bill?
I think that's a great starting point, that you know
Yep.
who you're dealing with, and then you have a way to
Yeah.
verify it.
Government ID, a government issued ID. The other thing, please, this is important. Paragraph 2, the legal description, please have that right. Don't mess that up. I
And
can't
whatever
tell.
on the CAD is usually the best you're going to do. So follow
Yes.
what's on the CAD as best you can, because that's all we're going to have access to either at the very beginning. And the property address, including the zip code, please. I mean, I can look up
Yes.
a zip code in no time, but it's just something else to do. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. And often this is a fairly recent update. If your property that you're buying has a tenant, check this box. If you know there's a tenant, check that box. You can always come back later, but you have remedies in the event of there being a residential lease. For example, prorated rents, it's been identified, security deposits, anything like that, that come when you check that box. Earnest money, you have to deliver it. Look at what it says. Within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver to, thank goodness now it says escrow agent at, and that's the name and the address, how much you deliver as earnest money and how much you deliver as option fee. The earnest money and option fee will be made payable to the escrow agent. Don't write some random check. I have dealt with that. It's crazy. Okay. To the escrow agent. If I'm working with Bill at Chicago Title, the check is made out to Chicago Title. It's not made out to the seller. I make it out to Chicago Title because they hold that money. The termination is the option that you get, number of days you specify based on paying for the option fee. Right here. I don't know if anybody can see my cursor, but I'm circling it. That's not included in your earnest money on the 1 to 4 residential contract. It is a separate fee. Make sure you put that somewhere. We've talked a lot about title policy and survey in paragraph 6. So we'll skip ahead. In paragraph 7, you talked about the property condition. As investors, I'm assuming that generally we are receiving the property as an as is status. We're not looking for them to do any extra work. However, we do want the disclosures. That protects both of you. Please get your seller's disclosures. And if the property was built before 78 or before, get your lead-based paint addendum. Here's where it says the buyer accepts the property as is, or the buyer accepts the property as is, provided seller at seller's expense shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments. This is where you need some precision. You need precision here. Don't just get fix the mailbox. Replace existing mailbox with such and such mailbox. Here's an example. Become pedantic in the specifics on your contract. It's very important. If you are an investor that's an agent, you must complete the sales agent or broker disclosure. Please don't skip that. Put in a closing date that you think is actually going to work. In Dallas, you can close things faster than you can in rural Texas. So the closing date should be reflective of where you are and how soon you think all of the items that lead up to the transaction closing can actually occur. And then possession. Oh, Bill, let's talk about this. Investors, you take possession upon closing and funding or according to this residential lease. It's important that just because you as the investor has signed the documents, it is not yours until the seller has closed and both parties have been funded. You can't just start showing up at the property just because you've signed the documents. And I've had this happen fairly recently. And also
Exactly. If the property's vacant, don't start construction. Don't start ripping out walls, because if for some reason it doesn't go through, now you've damaged the property.
Yep. And here's the thing, there are times when things just don't close or don't close when they're supposed to. It happens. Wait until all the ink is dried and all the money has changed hands. Please wait for that. And then paragraph 11 has special provisions. If you want to write something on your own behalf, if you're the buyer, feel free. This is not where you as agents just write random stuff on behalf of your client. This is especially useful for investors. I would seek legal advice if you feel uncomfortable. You can also add stuff that goes beyond this line. You can say see addendum or see additional page, whatever. Be specific. Sometimes I will buy multiple properties from the same person, and I will put that this contract refers to all of these different properties, addresses, plus legal descriptions. I will put it in special provisions. All right. Settlement and other expenses, I won't go into that as much, but let's just talk about casualty loss for a second. If it's damaged or destroyed by a casualty after the effective date of the contract, you have steps to follow. Perhaps the seller has hazard insurance for the property, and you can get something restored because something has happened after the effective date, and you can get it restored. And then that might be a great thing for you. Pay attention if you put a property under contract and there's a hailstorm. Maybe there's a roof claim you can get. Always pay attention. Paragraph 15, please read so you understand what the remedies are in case of a default, either by you or by the seller, if you're the buyer, or if you're someone assigning a contract, one of the assignees down the road. 15, 16, and 17 all deal with that. Make sure you understand what those mean.
Paragraph 15.
Mm-hmm.
That is stating the remedies that are available. There is nothing in that paragraph that is automatic. In other words, if the seller decides not to show up at closing,
Mm-hmm.
the buyer doesn't automatically get their earnest money back. You have your remedies listed out there, but nothing, just because somebody doesn't show up or something does not mean that any of these things, like getting your earnest money back as liquidated damages or anything like that, is just going to happen. Because until all parties agree to terminate the contract, there's still a contract. So don't be for some, that paragraph provides a false sense of security, because many parties believe that it's like, well, this says, well, yeah, it says that, but you have to terminate the contract. You can't unilaterally terminate the contract. All parties have to agree to the termination and the disposition of the earnest money, or it becomes something that's left out there that you can't.
Might have to litigate.
Mm-hmm. You might have to go to court.
Yep.
Yep.
And Yeah, well, we won't go into that. So, and the
Yeah,
other
but I just
thing I
wanted to
want
make sure that people are clear
people,
on that.
yeah, read that paragraph, read it again, read it again. Here's another thing that not everybody thinks about. If the seller is a foreign person, as identified by the Internal Revenue Code and its regulations, or if seller fails to deliver an affidavit or a certificate of non-foreign status to buyer, that seller is not a foreign person, then buyer shall withhold from the sales proceeds an amount sufficient to comply with applicable tax code. Now, luckily, the only time I've had to do that, the closing agent was, what is it called? FIPRA or something? FIPRA
FERPA,
knowledgeable.
FERPA.
FERPA, yeah, and was able to make the necessary withholdings. But if for some reason that closing agent is not, you have to realize whose responsibility is it? Buyer shall withhold from the sales proceeds. They
And
put
that's
it on
when
the
the buyer
slide.
should get representation. And there are
Yeah,
companies to represent.
yes, please.
We're not in an area. I'm sorry, Julie.
Go ahead.
We're not in an area where this provision, title companies in certain parts of the country, or even in Texas, probably down in the border towns, Laredo, El Paso, McAllen, some of those places that are down close to the Mexico border, you may have higher instances of somebody that's a foreign national. They don't have a green card. They're not a U.S. citizen. They don't pay taxes in the U.S., all that fun stuff. They would be very familiar with this process and the exceptions to the rules. I dealt with it quite a bit in Florida before coming to Texas when I did title there from 2003 until I moved here in 2005. But in this part of Texas, it's very unusual for us to run into a situation where we have a foreign national, and it's highly recommended. There are companies just like, and we can talk about investment exchange, 1031 exchanges another time, but there are third parties out there that will make sure that this happens exactly how it's supposed to happen. But for running into a foreign national, I've had it happen twice in 17 years plus. I mean, it just doesn't happen very often. And the other great thing, and another good reason to get that seller's disclosure completed by the seller, is that is where the seller is supposed to disclose their residency status. It's now in the seller's disclosure. So you should know from the very beginning, when you get that disclosure, whether or not you're dealing with a foreign national. And then I guess we're going to go on to the next paragraph, 21.
Yes.
And please provide telephone numbers and email addresses for you and for your seller. It's so important for us to have this information, and especially with you folks being investors and not necessarily having an agent involved. If we don't have an email address for the seller, I can't communicate with them. And we have to be able to communicate with the buyer, with you, and with your sellers. And it's amazing to me how very experienced realtors that work in the regular real estate port and the non-investor stuff that don't put the proper information in there. And one of the things for you, that those of you who are realtors, and so many of them love to do this, put themselves in as the parties to be notified. Guess what? If you get notified
And you don't pass that on?
and you don't get it to your client, guess what? you are in big trouble. Because if the buyer sends the agent notification of something important like termination, and they, it says they're supposed to notify the buyer. Well, if the buyer notifies the seller's agent and the seller's agent doesn't pass that along, we could have a problem. Yep. Because then it could become an issue, especially if it was verbal. Everything should be in writing. Email is so easy. Text messages, a lot of people rely on them for communicating some things. I think anything that's of major importance should be done by email because it's traceable, trackable. Not that texts aren't, but it's much easier to keep an archive of emails than it is text messages. Yes. Setting up inspections or something like that, do it by text, but the other stuff is really important. And especially if somebody is defaulted. I'm sorry?
And all that stuff in the contract that talks about seller shall provide the buyer, buyer shall provide the seller, all that is based on providing it to the contact information
here.
Yes.
The contact information.
In paragraph 21. So if you're supposed to deliver something as the seller to the buyer and it's delivered per the email that's listed there, you as the seller have performed. The fact that the buyer doesn't have it, that's not your issue. Because you sign this contract and this paragraph is part of the contract that you sign. And then this is important because it tells you all of the other addenda that might be attached to this contract, which are part and parcel of the contract at execution. All of them. So if you check a box, let's say it's an addendum for a seller's disclosure of lead-based paint, or let's say a seller's temporary residential lease, all of that needs to be a part of this contract.
And we don't see them much anymore, but investors used to be really hot for short sales.
Yep.
Sometimes, because it's a lot, they're very hard, but there's things like that need to be on there. Addendum regarding residential leases, that reflects back to that first thing that Julie mentioned on the beginning of the contract.
Yep. All of that there. Okay. Oh, one more thing that's happened. If you're buying property in a property owners association, there are time of the essence clauses that are associated with this addendum that affect the contract. And that these are things for which the buyer could terminate. So if you're a realtor explaining this, make sure that your seller understands the many outs a buyer has. I have made that mistake not explaining that well to sellers because I was led to believe by their words they understood. Just go over it again. You add an addendum to the contract, make sure both parties understand the impact of that addendum that's been added and how it relates to whether or not either party can terminate the contract. Just keep it in mind. Consult an attorney. A lot of investors don't consult attorneys when they're buying the properties, even brand new investors. I'm not going to say I think it's required that you get an attorney. This is each person's specific view. But if you're going to have one, make sure you have all the contact information for your attorney here or here, because that is a notice that will be complied by all parties. And then back to the part where Bill mentioned, this is the date right here. It's the big date. Make sure it's completed before you send it to title. This is very important. If I, as an investor, submit an offer to a seller and the seller signs it and then does not complete this, I complete this. There have been times it's been missed, but usually I try to make sure I complete this. As of what date? This date. Everything begins. Day 0 is the date right here. If you have 3 days to do something, then this date is 0. Then you have 1, 2, 3 plus days. Okay.
The other thing to remember too, the title company cannot complete that date on your behalf, even if you send written instructions. That's how important that date is. It will get sent back to you to say, please fill in the date. We're not a party to the contract. We can't add things to it, even if we're instructed to. On that.
There you go.
That's a big one.
That is a big one. This, I don't even know how to say how important that is, but it's really important. All of your other dates hinge on this. Now,
once you've read the contract, you will see exactly why that's there. It all becomes, in my opinion, it becomes crystal clear.
Crystal clear. And here's another thing. The stuff that we're talking about right now, it's not the snappy, exciting stuff. It's not the sexy stuff, the glitzy stuff. Oh my gosh, we're doing in real estate investing. But it is the stuff that once you know it will protect your hiney. So read every bit. This part has to do with establishing who are the procuring brokers. If there isn't one, then this shouldn't be completed out. If there is one, and here's something that I've recently run into where I'm an investor and I'm trying to buy a property that's listed. And I told the agent, you know what, go ahead and be my intermediary. I don't care. You know, you're getting instructions from me. I'm going to look over everything. And in this one case, the agent wasn't acting as an intermediary. This person wasn't taking care of the things they were supposed to. So I changed the contract before it was executed. And I said, you know what? I'm going to be my own because you're not handling things. I can't trust you. I'm going to be over there also as an agent. So I represented myself. And there was some discussion. I was like, oh, well, the original offer had this. And I was like, yeah, but you weren't handling anything. And I was very forthright. If you were going to handle everything, I would have been fine with your having both sides. But you did not. Therefore, you won't be handling both sides. And that's how we talked about that.
And I generally, if there's a commission due to the buyer's agent, make sure it's listed down there on the bottom of that page.
Right there. Yeah. Put it there.
There's fill it in.
Fill it in. Generally speaking, on MLS, that's what you put there. What's on MLS. Yep. But if it's signed, let's say the listing agent put in a 2.5%, but you put in a 3%, and it gets past everybody. Oh, well, they're paying you a 3%. I love this page because in addition to saying what is the effective date, it's like, okay, the option fee was received when, by whom, on what date, in what form. The earnest money was received. The contract was received. In the event that additional earnest money is needed, then it was received. I'm a big fan of making sure these are completed, because that way, let's say I get a property under contract with somebody and I wait 3 days before I send it to title. That does not impact my need to adhere to the days effective in the contract because I didn't get it to title. I just messed around and got it late. But it protects title from not appearing to have not done their job because they're like, well, we received the contract on this day. So they sign it and send it out. We received the option fee and the earnest money on this day. And if you develop a relationship with a great title escrow agent like Bill Kunowsky is, then you might get a reminder. Hey, you haven't paid your earnest money. Oh, let me get on that, so you can comply. Those relationships are important. I don't even know how many deals we've done together, Bill, but we've done a lot of them.
Oh gosh. It's been a lot. There's been a lot. But one thing I'm going to say is, since we're in this contract, is that these forms are available on the Texas, is it on TREC's website?
On TREC. Yeah, I'm just going to say this.
Yeah, you can Google TREC, TREC space forms. These are all fillable most of them are all fillable PDFs. And if you tab through it, it's going to take you to the next thing, and it will remind you rather than trying. And the other thing is, if you type it, if you key it in a fillable form, it's much easier for us to interpret than, some of you folks have beautiful handwriting and some don't. And it's not always the easiest for us to follow. My hand gets tired of receipt. I have a blank form and I already have it. The receipted portion, I went in and completed that portion of it, and I have it set the fillable PDF saved. So all I have to do is go into the top and fill in the property address, and then I can hand write the specifics, but it saves me a lot of time. And for you, do one and don't save over it. Just put all your information, all your standard stuff in one and save it. Then all you have to do is add seller information, and do a save as and name it. And then you already have a pre-filled contract. All you have to do is to go back and fill in the seller stuff and the property information, because most investors stick to the same verbiage. In many cases, they have a certain way that they like to do their business. Pre-fill the darn contract with as much as you can and save it. Not only does it save time, it keeps you from missing something that you may be really important to you, that of great value to you. And again, a lot of times with preparation, it keeps it. You're doing it with a clear head. You're not thinking about other things that you're wanting to do with the property and this, that, and the other. You just have to get your seller's information in there, your sales price, and lot and block. But the rest of your stuff, unless there's certain new specific things to this property that need to be put in there. But you can do a real generic save of this, and it will save most all of your information into it. And then just do save as you go, because God knows that's my world. Make it easier for you along the way. This won't be your first and only transaction, hopefully.
No, it won't. So anyway, we have gone over, so we're going to stop this at an hour and a half. I hope people who have been listening have found some useful gems. Bill, I appreciate your time. Hopefully you'll come back on again, because there's more to this conversation about the role of title to an investor than has been covered today. So there are some other things I'd like to cover more in depth that we've sort of touched on. But again, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate all of your interaction with me. Tomorrow is Pitranomics. We're doing a Thursday talk about the strategy, pay Uncle Sam what he's due. So that's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Central Time. Thank you, Bill, for joining us for this.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. And have a great day. You guys take good care.
David. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.